Picture something so ordinary you probably did it 3 times before breakfast this morning. You turned on a tap. Water came out. Clean, cold, instantly. No thought required. Now picture doing that same thing the hard way. Walking half a football field to a spring, filling 2 heavy buckets, carrying them back across a muddy yard 6 times a day, every day, for 41 years. That is not a scene from the distant past. For millions of Americans, that was just Tuesday. And the story of how this country went from buckets and springs to hot water on demand is one of the strangest, slowest, most unequal stories in American history. It involves cholera, a genius engineering trick that uses no pumps at all, a potato field that changed suburban life forever, and a city that poisoned its own children while officials looked the other way. By the time this is over, you will never turn on a faucet quite the same way again. Let's start with a woman in North Carolina. Sometime around 1892, a young woman married a farmer and moved into a wooden house with no indoor plumbing. The nearest water source was a spring 60 yards from her back door. From the first day of that marriage, she made that walk, 6 times on a light day, more on laundry days, more again during harvest. She hauled water for cooking, for bathing, for washing clothes, for watering animals, for everything a household needs to stay alive, for 41 years. When a historian eventually calculated the total distance she had covered on those trips back and forth from that spring, the number came out to more than 6,000 miles. That is the distance from the Atlantic coast of the United States to the Pacific coast and back again. She was not remarkable for this. She was typical. In households without plumbing during the first half of the 20th century, water collection alone ate up 6 to 8 hours per week. Not per month. Per week. An entire working day, every single week, just gathering enough water to survive. And the person doing that work was almost always a woman or a child. Men worked the land, women worked the water. The tools were exactly what you would expect from a pre-industrial existence. Wooden buckets, tin pails, and occasionally a shoulder yoke that let you carry 2 buckets at once and split the weight across your back. You can see these yokes in old photographs of rural Appalachia, the Mississippi Delta, the southern coastal plains. Every drop of water in those photographs cost something: time, sore muscles, daylight that could have gone elsewhere, and a body that wore out faster than it should have. Here is where the story gets darker. Most people doing that hauling had no idea the water was trying to kill them. For the first 2 centuries of American life, water came from wherever you could find it. Wells were the most reliable option, but digging one meant 20 to 100 feet of hand labor through soil and rock, lined with stone or timber to keep the walls from caving in. Rainwater barrels collected runoff from the roof. Springs and streams were walked to and carried from. In colonial towns, some early planners tried to route water through the streets using the most sophisticated technology available at the time. Hollowed-out logs, fitted end to end and buried underground. Boston laid what is often cited as the first urban water system in America in 1652, a network of these wooden log pipes designed mainly to give firefighters a water supply, because cities at the time had a habit of burning completely to the ground. Nobody was particularly concerned about drinking water, not because people were careless, but because the connection between contaminated water and disease had not yet been established. Science had not caught up. If the water looked reasonably clear and did not smell like something had died in it, people drank it. Sometimes they drank it even when it did smell, because they had nothing else. The idea that perfectly clear, odorless water could be silently full of something that would kill you had simply never occurred to anyone. Not to physicians, not to city planners, not to anyone. That particular ignorance was about to announce itself in the most catastrophic way possible. In the summer of 1832, a disease that had been moving across the globe for years finally reached New York City. Cholera had originated in South Asia, worked its way through Europe, and crossed the Atlantic aboard immigrant ships from Ireland, passing through Montreal and sliding south down the Hudson River into Lower Manhattan. Within weeks of its arrival, the city was in the grip of a full epidemic. It moved first into the poorest, most densely packed neighborhoods. The 6th Ward, centered on the 5 Points district, was hit the hardest. Dozens of families were packed into tenement buildings with no ventilation, sharing shallow wells that sat just feet away from leaking privy pits and garbage heaps. Sewage was seeping directly into the groundwater, and the groundwater was going directly into their drinking supply. Cholera is a particularly brutal way to die. It moves fast. A person could feel well in the morning and be gone by nightfall. The disease causes extreme dehydration through violent vomiting and diarrhea, and in severe cases, the skin takes on a bluish-gray color as the body begins to shut down. People in their final hours often called out desperately for water, consumed by thirst that nothing could relieve. The horrifying irony was that water was exactly what was finishing them off. By the time that summer's epidemic had run its course, around 3,500 New Yorkers were dead from a total city population of about 250,000. Adjust that to today's population of New York City, and you are looking at something equivalent to 100,000 deaths in a single season. And not one person in a position of authority understood what had caused it. Germ theory was still 3 decades away. Louis Pasteur would not demonstrate the link between microorganisms and disease until 1860. John Snow would not connect a London cholera outbreak to a specific contaminated water pump until 1854. In 1832, the reigning scientific consensus was miasma theory, the belief that disease was carried through bad air, through foul smells rising from rotting garbage and stagnant swamps. Smell something terrible and it might kill you. That was the best thinking medicine had to offer. So the city did not look at its water, it looked at its poor. City officials and prominent church leaders issued public statements declaring that cholera was divine punishment for moral weakness. The neighborhoods dying fastest were the ones home to immigrants, alcoholics, and those deemed spiritually deficient. The garbage-choked streets, the open sewers, the overcrowded housing, these were treated not as failures of infrastructure, but as symptoms of character. The people were sick, the argument went, because they deserved to be sick. Meanwhile, the water supply remained exactly as it was. But the epidemic did accomplish one thing that years of poverty and suffering in those neighborhoods never had. It scared the people with money. Cholera does not check addresses before it spreads. Once it burned through the 5 Points district, it began creeping north, into neighborhoods where the merchants and property owners lived, where the people with city council connections and real estate holdings slept at night. The moment the disease became a threat to the wealthy, clean water stopped being a charity question and became a survival question. Within 2 years of the epidemic, New York City voters approved a plan to bring in an entirely new water supply. It turned out the answer had been 41 miles away the entire time. Philadelphia, to its credit, had moved first. Back in 1815, it became the first American city to build a publicly operated water system for general residential use. The Fairmount Water Works pulled water from the Schuylkill River using steam-powered turbines, pushed it through cast-iron pipes, and sent it to homes and public hydrants across the city. The use of cast iron was a genuine turning point. For most of their history, American cities had been using the same hollowed log technology that Boston had installed in the 1600s. Wood rotted, wood cracked. Wood could not hold meaningful water pressure. Cast iron changed all of that, and Philadelphia was the first city in the world to make the full switch. New York's project, when it finally came, was on a different scale entirely. Construction on the Croton Aqueduct began in 1837 under Chief Engineer John Jervis. The goal was to capture water from the Croton River in Westchester County, 41 miles north of the city, and carry it to Manhattan entirely by gravity. No pumps, no engines, just a very slight and carefully calculated downward slope, 13 inches for every mile of tunnel, that would let the earth itself do the work. Between 3,000 and 4,000 laborers, most of them Irish immigrants earning roughly $1 per day, blasted through bedrock, carved tunnels through hillsides, and laid an elliptical brick-encased iron tube 8.5 feet tall and 7.5 feet wide across the entire route. On the morning of June 22, 1842, Jervis opened the Croton Dam. It took 22 hours for the water to travel the full 41 miles into Manhattan. To mark the moment, 4 engineers got into a small wooden boat named the Croton Maid and rode the current through the aqueduct itself, gliding through a dark brick tunnel at about 2 miles per hour all the way to the Harlem River. 4 men in a boat, inside a tunnel, inside a hill, watching clean water flow toward a city that had not had any in a very long time. The public celebration on October 14th drew 250,000 people to Broadway, the largest parade the city had ever held. Crowds stretched from the Battery all the way to Union Square. At City Hall Park, a newly installed cast-iron fountain shot Croton water 50 feet into the air, and vendors walked through the crowd offering drinks they called Croton cocktails, which was simply water mixed with lemonade. People cheered for it. For a city that had watched 3,500 of its residents die of waterborne disease a decade earlier, the sight of clean water shooting into the sky was not just impressive. It was something close to salvation. The years that followed transformed life in the wealthy parts of Manhattan. Indoor plumbing arrived in homes. Bathtubs appeared. Coiled metal tubes attached to coal-burning stoves made hot water possible without heating it over an open fire. Public bathhouses opened for those who could not afford private plumbing. By 1844, over 6,000 homes were connected to the Croton system, and waterborne illness rates had already begun to fall. Other cities followed: Boston, Baltimore, Detroit, St. Louis, each one building its own version of what New York had done. But each of those successes was quietly surrounded by a much larger failure. By 1900, roughly half of all Americans still had no access to any kind of public water supply. And even that figure is misleading, because the people who did have access were almost entirely concentrated in cities. The countryside, where most Americans still actually lived at the turn of the century, had almost nothing. Farm families across the Midwest, the Deep South, Appalachia, and the Great Plains were still relying on hand-dug wells, creek water, rainwater collection, and bucket hauls. Not because they were behind the times, because the economics of piping water to scattered rural households were completely different from piping it through dense city blocks. The cost per family was enormous. Nobody was going to absorb that cost voluntarily. Not the states, not the counties, and certainly not farmers who were barely keeping their land. So the gap widened year by year. Cities modernized, rural America waited. Even within cities, the gap was brutal. Upper-class neighborhoods in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia had fully functioning indoor plumbing by the 1870s. A few streets over, working-class tenements might share a single cold water faucet in a hallway, serving dozens of families. In some buildings, the only water access was a courtyard pump. Outdoors in February, outdoors in August. The difference between those two realities was not principally about work ethic or ambition. It was about whether your children had clean water to drink. Nothing more and nothing less. The federal government spent decades ignoring this. When Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal finally turned attention to the problem in the 1930s, it was not framed as a public health emergency. It was a jobs program. The Public Works Administration funded water and sewer construction. The Works Progress Administration built roads and utilities. The Farm Security Administration offered low-interest loans to struggling rural families, some of which went toward wells and basic plumbing. The Tennessee Valley Authority built dams and power systems across 7 impoverished states. The Rural Electrification Administration brought power, lines to the countryside, and once you had electricity, you could run a pump, and once you had a pump, you could have running water without carrying anything. Progress happened, but it happened slowly, and it happened unevenly. The federal programs tended to flow toward communities that already had the organizational capacity to apply for grants and manage construction. The most isolated families, the ones most in need, were often the last to benefit. The Farm Security Administration sent documentary photographers into rural America during the 1930s to record what they found. The images that came back stopped people cold. Families dipping buckets into drainage ditches, children sharing stream water with livestock, women hauling water barefoot across muddy fields. These photographs were not from the previous century. They were taken in the wealthiest country on earth in the decade before the Second World War. By 1940, the first year the national census formally asked Americans about their indoor plumbing, 45% of all homes in the United States reported having none. In 10 states, the figure was worse than 70%. Not frontier territories, states with millions of people living in them. What finally cracked the problem open was a war and a potato field. World War II pulled the country's manufacturing capacity into overdrive. And when the fighting ended, all of that industrial momentum had to go somewhere. Factories that had been building aircraft and military equipment shifted to consumer goods. Construction firms that had built military installations shifted to housing. And millions of returning veterans, backed by GI Bill mortgages that required little or no money down, were looking for homes to raise families in. What they found, starting in 1947, was Levittown. William Levitt and his company broke ground on a former potato farm in Nassau County, Long Island, and built houses at a pace that had never been seen before in residential construction. One house every 16 minutes, 36 workers per house, 27 specialized steps, each performed by a dedicated crew, moving from lot to lot like an assembly line that never stopped moving. The first homes sold for $7,900. Within a few years, more than 17,000 houses stood where that potato field had been, and more than 84,000 people lived in them. Every single one of those homes had a flush toilet, a kitchen sink, hot and cold running water. Indoor plumbing was not an upgrade or a premium option. It was just part of what a house was. For families who had grown up sharing a hallway tap with 40 neighbors, or making 12 trips to a well on wash day, turning a single handle and feeling hot water rise in a porcelain tub was not a small thing. Laundry that had consumed entire days of boiling and hand scrubbing now took a couple of hours. Baths that had required trips to the spring with buckets happened in minutes. Women who had given years of physical labor to water retrieval suddenly had time back. Not a little time. Hours per week. Every week. Levittown was copied everywhere almost immediately. By the mid-1950s, 85% of new home construction in the United States was happening in suburban developments. San Fernando Valley, Outer Chicago, Greater Atlanta. The model was the same everywhere. Mass-produced homes, standard appliances, plumbing included without question. The numbers shifted dramatically. In 1950, about a quarter of all American homes still lacked complete plumbing. By 1960, that was down to roughly 1 in 6. By 1990, it was under 1%. But pause on 1960 for a moment. That was the same year the United States was beginning to put astronauts in space capsules. The country had coast-to-coast television, a new interstate highway system stretching 41,000 miles, and somewhere between 10 and 15 million people who still did not have a toilet inside their home. The suburban revolution had solved the problem for tens of millions of families. It had left entire regions behind. Appalachia, the rural Deep South, migrant farm camps in California and Texas, and Native American reservations across the Southwest. The gap was not random. Research by the nonprofits Dig Deep and the U.S. Water Alliance identified race as the single strongest predictor of water access in America. Native American households were 19 times more likely to lack indoor plumbing than white households. Black and Latino families were nearly twice as likely. The infrastructure expansion that had transformed cities and suburbs had been structured, consciously or not, to exclude specific communities. If your town had been passed over, if your reservation had never been connected, if your neighborhood had been systematically denied federal investment, you were simply outside the system. In 1974, Congress passed the Safe Drinking Water Act, establishing for the first time a federal framework for water quality standards, mandatory testing, and EPA enforcement. For the next several decades, it largely worked. Waterborne illness rates dropped sharply. Americans trusted their tap water in a way they had not in the previous century. The long arc of progress seemed to be holding. Then, in 2014, the city of Flint, Michigan, made a budget decision. To cut costs, Flint switched its water supply from the Detroit municipal system to the Flint River. The river water was more chemically corrosive than what the pipes had previously carried, and the city failed to add the anti-corrosion treatment that would have protected those aging pipes. Lead began leaching directly into the water supply. Residents started complaining almost immediately about the color, the taste, the smell. Officials told them the water was safe and continued telling them that for months. It was not safe. By the time independent researchers confirmed dangerously elevated lead levels in the blood of Flint's children, irreversible neurological damage had already been done. Internal EPA communications later showed that agency staff had raised serious concerns about Flint's water quality well before the crisis went public. Those concerns had been minimized, delayed, and set aside. Flint was not some remote community without infrastructure. It was an American city with a functioning municipal water system, state oversight, and federal regulatory machinery specifically designed to prevent exactly what happened. The system failed anyway, and if it could fail in Flint, there was no honest argument that it could not fail anywhere. On the Navajo Nation, the largest indigenous reservation in the country, spread across portions of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, around 30% of households today have no running water at all. Families routinely drive 45 minutes each way to fill containers at windmill pumps. They pay for water volume by the barrel, the same way people bought goods from traveling merchants 150 years ago. A retired community health worker from the reservation described waking up every morning with the same first thought: where is the water coming from today? Hauling water, hauling firewood, using an outdoor toilet in desert heat. This is not historical description. This is the 1930s era reality that a portion of America has never left. When COVID-19 swept across the country, the Navajo Nation recorded some of the highest per capita infection rates anywhere in the United States. One major contributing factor was that people could not wash their hands with any regularity. The Indian Health Service estimated that basic water and sanitation infrastructure for the reservation alone would cost around $200 million. Piping a single remote home can run into the millions. The math never quite closes, and the gap never quite closes with it. That woman in North Carolina who walked 6,000 miles to her spring over 41 years of marriage, her house may still be standing, and it may still depend on that spring. The average American today uses around 88 gallons of water per day. They turn a handle and it appears. They flush without thinking. They fill a glass for a child in the middle of the night without calculating the weight of 2 buckets or the distance to the nearest spring. Cooking, cleaning, bathing, sanitation, the cup of water on the nightstand. All of it runs on a system so deeply embedded in daily life that most people are genuinely unaware it exists at all. Below every American street lies a network of pipes, valves, treatment plants, pumping stations, and storage facilities that represents one of the most ambitious public works efforts in the history of the world. It was not constructed by a single law or a single great mind. It was assembled over 2 centuries through cholera outbreaks and engineering breakthroughs, through political pressure and federal programs, through one crisis at a time and one pipe at a time. It was built unevenly, reaching prosperous cities generations before it reached the countryside, and still leaving specific communities behind in ways that were not accidents. The pipes beneath your feet are the most important infrastructure in your life, and almost no one ever thinks about them. Every shower, every clean meal, every drink of water that does not make you sick traces back to a decision that was made again and again across 200 years. The decision that water should not have to be carried, that it should flow. That decision is unfinished. It is still being made. If you found this story worth knowing, consider sharing it with someone who turns on a tap without thinking, which is most of us. And if you want more of the hidden history embedded in the things we take for granted every day, there is a lot more of it here. The stories do not stop.